note that Jasper Jones is a crime fiction novel and there's a death to investigate, but the real crime is a societal crime. And that is, those in position of power abuse their power and thus justice is not served. So the narrative of the novel could be that Jasper is arrested and convicted of the murder of Laura Wishart. But instead, Charlie takes on the Atticus Finch role and he fights for justice. For the truth is what he's really looking for. And when we consider the voice in the novel, Charlie's voice is one of uncertainty, and he's navigating the path from childhood innocence to adulthood. He's coming to understand that the world is complex and reality is often different to what he once believed. And that's because he's a young child and he's, starting to develop into an adult. For example, he had believed that the police were the good guys, but through his experience with Jasper, he comes to learn about institutionalised racism. So despite the lack of evidence or a body, Jasper is taken in and presumed guilty of murdering Laura. And this awakens Charlie's sense of injustice. So, yes, there is a crime that has to be investigated, but it turns out that the crime is much bigger than Laura Wishart. It is the institutionalised racism and the abuse of power by those in authority in the society. So Craig Sylvia, the author, uses many devices to develop Charlie's developing worldview. So he calls on Atticus Finch and Mark Twain for guidance quite often. And Sylvia also incorporates the story of Sylvia Likens into the narrative to strengthen Charlie's growing awareness and his developing voice. The Sylvia Likens case, and by the way, this is based on a true story, and it feeds Charlie's sense of his own righteousness. It develops his voice of protest, and despite his lack of power, he begins to form a moral stance and an objection to injustice. And this scene sort of seems insignificant in the novel, but Sylvia's included it for a reason. So what we'll do is we're going to have a look at pages 109 to 113. That's the whole sort of main scene of the Sylvia Likens story. But we're just going to focus from page 112. So if you have your novel, if you want to get that out, just pause for a second and go to page 112 and find the chapter it's just before halfway on the page, one of the hardest things. We'll have a look at that. So one of the hardest things for me to understand is why Jenny waited until then to speak out. She watched on for all those months. She'd been there for every savage act. She had the chance. Hadn't she been at school while Sylvia was housebound? She could have told somebody there. But it's not just Jenny. It's the whole choir of mute voices that puts a lump in my throat. Why didn't anybody help her? The neighbourhood knew. Oh, they knew. The folks next door, the Vermillions, they'd been there and they'd seen the extent of Sylvia's injuries. They'd heard the screams and commotion, the thump of the shovel, but not a sound came from their side. They let it happen. Did they not care? Whole blocks of people, whole towns, a whole city, whole clusters of families. Not one of them uttered a word. And how was it that Gertrude Banzweski could seduce so many children into committing these acts? How could they turn up day after day and do the unspeakable? And how could they return home of an evening, no words of shame or remorse tumbling from their mouths? What did Sylvia Likens do to deserve this? Or was it just sheer luck and chance? Everything bubbles up in me. I have to snatch it and squash it before it boils over. I've read too much. I've seen too much. I'm in a strange daze, angry and bewildered. I don't know what to do with myself. I want to wash my shaking hands of all this. I want to clear my head. I wish I could unknow all that I'd learned. Exercise the memory of Eric Cook and Albert Fish and wring my heart dry of Sylvia Likens. And Laura Wishart? Right now, I'd tear it all out of me in a second. I'd choose to forget. I'd sleep safe in my settled snow dome, and I'd close my window to Jasper Jones. I leave the library feeling exhausted, leaving the messy stack on the desk. I squint in the sunlight and wonder where to go. After a whole morning's reading, I've collected more questions than answers. So when we read this whole scene, we're disturbed by it, and it's inconceivable that an atrocity like this could occur. So like Charlie, we're sheltered or protected from such horrific occurrences. We feel a moral outrage. How could such a horrible act occur? What would make someone be so cruel? The answer boils down to the abuse of power. So sometimes people in positions of power do terrible things. We can all think of examples. So in the novel, Charlie is dumbfounded that such cruelty exists, and so are we. So what it does is it contributes to Charlie's sense of justice, and he sees innocent people vilified, and it upsets him. So he sees Jasper's treatment by the police. He sees Jeffrey's parents' treatment because of the Vietnam War, and Jeffrey's treatment, of course, as well. He sees Sylvia Likens' abuse of power. And ultimately, it helps this quiet boy gain the strength to speak out against injustice. So when you think about it, we're just like Charlie. We identify with his growing realisation that the world is not fair, and we become empowered to reject injustice. And perhaps this is Sylvie's purpose. He wants us to call out injustice when we see it. And in giving Charlie a voice, he is in fact giving us a voice. So our moral compass is strengthened by sharing Charlie's experience. And I suppose we can see that he's not calling on us to become renegades or vigilantes and go out and call out injustice, but it's more that there's a collective readership. You know, everyone that reads Jasper Jones becomes part of this community, and Craig Sylvia is basically is investing in us, is imparting this strength to us so that we are the quiet Australians, that we are out there, and while we might not speak out on a grand scale, our collective dislike of the abuse of power and injustice has a sort of a groundswell in the community. So it's an interesting thing to think about. Okay, so the task that we're going to, I can just move this down a fraction, it's not going to let me, just got it. The tasks that we're going to look at are these 4 questions, so you can have a look at those. If you want to come up with some responses for these, just some short responses and some ideas, and then we'll have a class discussion in our next lesson. We'll see you then.